Hello, everyone. This is Yassin Chickha. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. I have my own consulting company. We specialize in technology and project management. We service pretty much all company sizes, small to large. I have over 25 years of experience in technology and project management. Did serve on the board of directors for the Multinational PMI chapter, and for about 5 years, and I was the chapter president in 2007, where I had the pleasure of meeting many project managers locally and internationally, where I have done a lot of presentations and symposiums, conferences around the world. And this has been really one of my best things to do is really to share my knowledge, my experience with others. So sit back, enjoy the presentation, and we'll keep it fun as much as possible. So that's all about me. So we'll go ahead and start our presentation. So today's topic I'd like to share with everyone is how to manage multinational projects. Managing multinational projects is a challenge by itself. We know now a lot of the corporations have presence in worldwide, especially for the U.S. Companies. They have presence in Europe, in China, Asia in general, South America, etc. So it is really critical for anyone working on projects that have some kind of international dimension is to understand what challenges, issues, risk that you may be encountering when you are managing these types of projects. As you can see, things we have talked about is, U.S. firms have international as well as local presence, operations in the U.S. and worldwide. Sometimes you may be managing projects that have virtual teams, and I mean, all of us now, when we manage a project or a program, we may as well have team members, excuse me, located in China, India, maybe Egypt, maybe Brazil. I've really worked with probably many countries through my career, and have experienced that, hands-on. Also, one of the things that is critical, the international market is growing at a rapid pace. And as I mentioned, a lot of companies are vying for the space on the international market. There have been a lot of treaties. There have been a lot of, challenges around the international market. And therefore, as you can see, a lot of companies, if for example, do not have any presence internationally, they may partner with other companies that already have that already are in that space. So again, as you can see, it is a critical thing for us as project managers to really understand that market. So the things that I would like to share with you is basically talk about the basics. What are the basic requirements to manage a multinational project? Well, one of the things is we need to understand and identify the influences and considerations that are associated with managing these types of projects. We're going to talk about the culture, we're going to talk about the communication, the time zone, the currency exchange rate, many other things. So those would be the influences that you have to take into account. The second thing is to understand the nature of doing such business, understand the nature of the international business. And then finally, identify what risks are associated with those type of projects. As you know, in project management, identifying the risk, analyzing, managing the risk is probably one of the most critical knowledge areas that we have to deal with. So when you manage a multinational projects, those risks take a much bigger dimension than you would when you manage projects locally. So let's jump into the influences and considerations that we mentioned briefly, and those include, as you can see, cultural differences, the country infrastructure issues, the legal issues, contractual agreements, financial issues, staffing issues, the local government and political stability, technical standards, risk. So I'm going to cover some of those areas that I just mentioned. Due to the time limitation, may not be able to go into all of them, but I'll cover as much as possible, the ones that are really critical for us. So the first one that comes to mind as far as cultural differences is communication. There are language barriers. There are possibility for miscommunications. Nonverbal communication is a big factor, especially let's talk about a couple scenarios, especially if you are located in the U.S. and your teams are overseas. You pretty much have zero verbal communications. You're going to have to rely on your voice. You're going to have to rely on emails and chat, etc. Then we're going to talk about briefly about the types of cultures that exist, and those would be the cultures that sociologists and psychologists have divided the world into. Then we're going to talk about the social factors, possibly, class, the social class, where people work, how people take pride of what they do, types of holidays. Here maybe in the U.S., we celebrate, for example, Christmas, we celebrate Thanksgiving, but that's not the case worldwide. Some countries may celebrate Christmas at a different time. For example, in the U.S., we celebrate Christmas on December 25th, or whatever, the last Thursday. However, in Egypt, it's basically in January, so it's not the same time. So holidays are critical. You also have, maybe Muslims' holidays that are different. In India, there are different holidays that are not the same time as we would have our holidays. So you have to take into account those holidays because they may impact your project. Time and commitment is also another factor. Behaviors, religions, the style of negotiation. So we're going to cover some of those, areas. We kind of briefly define them and talk about how we can basically address them. Communication. So how does communication work? Well, just a basic communication style. Okay, you have a sender, you have a receiver, you have a message. We all know that, right? That's the basic of communication. What really matters the most is those filters. Some people call them noises. Okay, the filters or the noises are the things that really distract the message. If you say good morning to one of your work associates, and she or he doesn't respond back, you may question yourself, what's wrong? Did I say something bad? So you send that message to that individual. The response you got back is silence. Okay, silence is a message. If somebody does not say anything to you, they're giving you a message, right? But then really what it is the filters that are distracting the message that your associate has sent back to you, which is silence. Could be maybe some kind of emotional status, maybe that associate not feeling well that day, maybe they're having some personal issues, don't feel like talking. That's what we call noises, the things that distract the message and kind of make us wonder what went wrong. So the other thing is when we talk about the second part of communication. As you know, we have verbal and we have nonverbal. As you know, nonverbal communication is probably the most critical than verbal. For example, some cultures may interpret your body language differently. Some gesture can have different meanings in different parts of the world. And so, for example, here in the U.S., when we shake our heads up and down, we mean agreement. But when Bulgarians do that, they really mean no. So it's the opposite. So another thing as far as differences in culture, for example, the word nova, N-O-V-A-A, N-O-V-A. Well, we know what nova means in English. It's basically a shining star that becomes very bright all of a sudden, and then the light kind of fades away in a few months or maybe a year. However, when the car maker, I think it was Chevrolet, wanted to market its car Nova in Latin America, Mexico and Colombia, etc., the marketing campaign failed tremendously. And the reason being is the word Nova in English means great, it's a shining star, but in Spanish means does not run. And so, you don't expect a consumer to buy a vehicle that does not run. So basically, the same word can have different meaning, and as we saw in the situation of Nova, that was a pretty bad, actually, issue. Different assumptions are made in the same situation can be interpreted in many different ways, depending when someone comes from. So, for example, the sight of a black cat is considered a lucky event in Britain. However, it is considered unlucky in many other countries. Also, here in the U.S., we believe, superstitiously, that cats have 9 lives, right? Therefore, the cat food maker 9 lives. If they want to do marketing in other countries, some countries believe cats have 7 lives, not 9 lives. So if they want to market their product in countries where they believe cats have 7 lives, that slogan or the product name is gonna be meaningless. It doesn't really mean, people say that's not our cat. Our cats are 7 lives, not 9 lives. Also, silence is a form of communication, as I mentioned. So that's one of the things is, as far as body language, if you are, for example, dealing with a virtual team, you are missing that part of the communication. You're going to have to rely solely on your voice and written communication to communicate with your team members or stakeholders, etc. So as you can see, the communication filters or the communication challenges do exist, and it takes some time to really overcome those challenges. We talk about nonverbal communication as a big factor, such as, when we say nonverbal means body language, such as hand gesture, body position. If you and I have a meeting, and I sit and I lay back and I cross my arms, you would wonder, what's wrong with Yassin? Is he not happy with maybe the presentation? Does he have any questions, etc.? So really, our body language tells a lot about us, and I think sociologists believe that the nonverbal communication accounts for about 90% of our communication. So, facial expressions such as eye contact, eyebrows movement, etc. All of those, make an impression. They believe that a person can make about 250,000 different facial expressions. That's a lot, as you can see. So really, your face tells a lot about you. Tells a lot about what you're thinking, etc. So the other thing is about eye contact. We know eye contact is a good communication instrument, right? So, but however, some cultures may not have good eye contact. It's not because they don't respect you. It's the other way. Some cultures may not look at you directly, because if they do that, they believe it's rude. So, like in Oriental countries, for example, in India, they refrain from having direct eye contact because that in that culture it's considered inappropriate. It's rude. Where for example, if you go for a job interview here in the U.S. and do not really have good eye contact, most likely you're not going to be considered for that opportunity, for that position. So as you can see, the eye contact can have a different interpretation. Miscommunications is a big factor, and you really have to find ways to ensure there are no miscommunications. Ensure that the receivers of your message really understood. Again, we're going back to the situation where you have virtual teams. Virtual communication is difficult, right? And so it's time consuming when you manage virtual team. So as I said, there is no body language, and then the 10-90 rule. So what is the 10-90 rule? Well, that's a rule I came up with. I don't know if it's valid or not, but I'd like to share it with you. Well, we just talked about that the body language is about 90% of your communication. So that leaves 10% of your communication capability. Now, we know project managers spend about 90% of their time communicating. So you're going to spend 90% of your time communicating using the available 10% of communication, which is verbal. Therefore, as it is called the 10-90 rule. So you really have a very small spectrum of communication that you'll be able to relay your message and ensure that the receivers have actually understood your message, right? And so that's basically one of the things is when you have virtual teams, or you have somebody in your team whose English is not the first language, or it is a second language, there are a few things maybe you can do to help you overcome the miscommunications. For example, try to use written communication as much as possible. Use simple terms and common words. For example, maybe here in the U.S. we use a lot of acronyms for a lot of things. If you live in Los Angeles, California, and you want to go to the airport, well, they call that LAX. So if you're trying to communicate to somebody in China and saying, I'm going to LAX, they're going to wonder, what does that mean? What is LAX? So you have to explain. So try to avoid using, acronyms. Stick with the simple terms and common words. Speak slowly and clearly as much as possible. We know sometimes that's a challenge if you have a lot of things that you need to cover. But again, if you can accomplish that, it would help you quite a bit in ensuring the receivers have actually understood your message. Ask when in doubt. If not, ask anyway. So what does that mean? Well, when you give a message to somebody from a different culture, different country, and you want to make sure they understood, ask them a question. Ask them about what you just told them to ensure that they have understood what you said, right? So make sure you ask questions. In critical situation where you have a critical document that you need to translate, try to use what we call back translation. What is back translation? Well, this is a situation where, for example, if you have a contract that is written in English and you need to translate that to maybe Chinese or Japanese, what you can do is have translator number one to translate the contract from English to Chinese, and then have translator number two to translate the same contract from Chinese back to English, and then compare the two and see if there's a good match. That way you are assured that the translation was successful. So that's called back translation. The next thing I want to talk about is around the cultural differences, is the types of culture. I think this is critical because, in project management, you have to deal with stakeholders. You have to motivate people, motivate your teams. So not everyone is motivated the same way, right? So sociologists have actually divided cultures into two areas, low context and high context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those. What do they mean? And how are you able to negotiate and motivate individuals or from those types of culture? So let's start with the low context culture. So in local context culture, this is where the people place more importance on the specific terms of the transaction. Okay, I will go into more details of what does that mean. The high context culture value more of the personal relationship and trust more than the transaction itself. So let's take an example, and on the next slide I'll show you how some of the countries kind of fit into that low context to high context spectrum. But let's share a couple of examples with you, kind of explain what we mean by low context. So let's start with the first one. So the first one is the type of culture where people place more importance on the specific terms of transaction. Maybe data. Those people are maybe data driven. So if you are trying to negotiate, let's keep it simple. If you're trying to sell a vehicle to a German person, somebody from Germany, and in order for that transaction to be successful and you sell the vehicle, you probably have to provide some technical data about the vehicle, and it goes from 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. It has 400 cc, it's a 300 horsepower engine, it's a 6 cylinders, etc., etc. Right? Basically, you are providing some technical details about the vehicle. Where the other side, when you have a high context culture, those individuals prefers the relationship and the trust more than the transaction itself. This type of culture they are group driven. So you would have to convince the individual that if you're trying to sell them the same vehicle as you're trying to sell the German person, that their family would enjoy it. Their father would love to ride in that car. So basically you're trying to relay a message about family, about tribes. Those individuals, they value the tribes, they value the family, etc. So that's what we mean by low context versus high context, right? So this is the spectrum that I mentioned. Kind of give you some examples about how countries have been kind of divided based on some, based on some sociologists' thought. So as you can see from the low context, you have German at the extreme. You can see what the U.S. and Canadian, they're about, two-thirds of the way. When you take it all the way to the right, on the high context culture, the Chinese kind of fit in that spectrum. Just kind of give you an idea about some of the countries and where they fit between the low to the high context. The next thing we're going to talk about around cultural differences is time and commitment. Some behaviors, religion, styles of negotiation, and decision making. So I think we talked about the low context versus the high context, and this is where the styles of negotiation is critical. As I mentioned, if you're trying to sell a vehicle to a German, well, that's a negotiation, right? You would have to provide data because Germans are data-driven individuals. But if you're trying to sell the same vehicle to a Chinese person, then you have to put it into a family, into a group context to be able to have a successful transaction. Next thing is talk about time value. Some cultures have different perception around the interpretation and the value of time. For example, here in the U.S., it is critical that you come on time. You have to be punctual when you come to meeting. Some other cultures may not be that critical. It is acceptable that if you come to the meeting 20 or 30 minutes late. I know, here in the U.S., let's say if they have a wedding and people say the reception will start at 5 p.m., people will show up at 5 p.m. maybe 10 minutes earlier. In some other cultures, they might be 2 hours late, and that's okay. It's acceptable. That's just, the perception of time. The other things that we deal with, when we're doing multinational projects is the time zone difference, right? The date and time zone. Well, even here in the U.S., we have 4 time zones, right? and let's say, I live in the East Coast. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. If I have a team members who lives in San Diego or Los Angeles, well, they're going to be 3 hours ahead of me. Behind of me. So that would make it a challenge. If I'm going to call for a meeting at 8 a.m. my time in the East Coast, that's going to be 5 a.m. in Pacific time. That's 3 hours behind me. It is unacceptable for me to schedule a meeting because of time zone. Well, think about the worldwide. Think about Australia. Australia is pretty much 14 and a half hours ahead of, East Coast. And basically, because they're 14 and a half, they're actually a day advance. So if I were to have a meeting with somebody in Sydney, and today, let's say, is August the 30th, which is a Thursday, and if I meet with them around maybe 5 p.m., believe it or not, that's 8 a.m. Friday. So when I say, today we're going to do this, they're going to come back and ask, what day are you talking about? Is it Thursday or Friday? What's today? So you have to be clear. You have to be careful to say that today is either your time or their time, right? Because that time zone difference. Same thing is true for China, India. China is 12 hours ahead of us. India, and some about 10 and a half. Some countries are 8 hours ahead of us. So, as you can see, you really have to take into account the time zone difference when you schedule a meeting. You have to be able to accommodate all these time zones, etc. And it makes it challenging, right? What really helps you, there's a tool on the web called World Clock. You can use that to adjust your time. Also think about the calendar date, okay? So for us in the U.S., we read the date as follows. For example, the one we have on the screen says 8607. In the U.S., we interpret that as August the 6th, 2007. However, if you go to Egypt, for example, or Saudi Arabia, that is actually the 8th day of June 2007. So it depends how, what type of calendar you're using, Gregorian, etc. Then the way you write those dates can be a big difference between the date we see on the screen and the date for somebody who lives in Egypt. It's about 2 months difference. So you got to be careful when you write the date. How do you solve that? Well, instead of writing the month as a number, spell it out. Say this is August the 6th, 2007. We talked about the end of day for some, which is the beginning for others, the situation between somebody who lives in the East Coast in the U.S. versus somebody who lives in Australia. They're 14 hours ahead of us. Therefore, today is Thursday for us. It's Friday for somebody in Australia. Other things to talk about cultural differences is some of the behaviors, the values, the attitudes, greetings, gender greeting. You may not be able to, in some culture, may not be able to greet a female the same way you would greet a male. Titles or forms. Some countries, they prefer to be called by the first name. Others would like to be called by the last name. So if you're not sure, ask, how would you like to be called? Or do some research. There's a lot of resources which I'll be sharing at the end of the presentation to help you understand how you would deal with different cultures. The age is a big deal. In some cultures, age is critical. Some cultures really value age. So you're going to see a lot of the executives in some corporations, let's say in the Middle East, they would be older than their regular employees. In the U.S., that may not be the case. Most of the time here you are placed based on your skills. Down there, age will play a big factor. Education, what school you went to, can really shape up your status, your social status. Also, other social status is a big factor. Depending on your social status, people may value your opinion, etc. Gender, we talked about that, between male and female, that can have some impact on your discussion, whatever. The negotiation style things we talked about briefly when we mentioned the the low context versus the high context culture. Again, for the high context culture, because those individuals, they value the group, they value the tribe, they like to build a relationship first before they can really do business with you. Like here in the U.S., you can, and also maybe Europe, you can enter into a negotiation right away. You can walk into the meeting and start talking business. Well, if you go to, for example, to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, other countries, no, you got to build that relationship first before you can really do any transaction, before you get them to agree to a contract. So it is critical. Religion is also another factor. Technology, the law of that country, people are afraid of the law, so they're not going to do anything that would be illegal. There's a lot of situations. Unfortunately, I don't really have enough time here to go into more details, but to kind of give you an idea about the things that you have to take into consideration. Also, when you are have a meeting in maybe some part of the world, you need to find out who will be making the decision. It could be the person who's doing the least talking. That would be making a decision. So you need to kind of understand who is the person that will make that decision, and don't make any assumption. This one here, this is a really good slide that I like a lot. This one kind of shows you, when we talked about the different cultures, there's another division that sociologists have actually divided people. You have the individualistic society versus the collectivistic society. And this is basically maybe 5 areas, maybe 5 factors that sociologists have sectored or segmented these 2 different types of cultures, the individualistic versus the collectivistic, where by definition the individualistic society places more emphasis on the individual as a definition, where the collectivistic places more emphasis on the group. So the group interest comes first, where in the first one, the individual interest comes first. In a society where it is labeled as individualistic, talking about maybe the power aspect, and those, in the individualistic, someone may gain that power from their position within the hierarchy, versus in the collectivistic, it's a power tolerance where individuals assumes authority in view of the perceived rightness of their own personal interest. So another thing is the uncertainty, where the individualistics, they have what we call uncertainty acceptance, where the other type is they have what's called uncertainty avoidance. This type of people, this type of cultures does not like uncertainty. They're not what we call them are risk averse, where the other one is risk tolerance. They would tolerate risk. And as you can see in the list, is just basically to give you some ideas how individuals from different types, the individualistic versus collectivistic societies, perceive these 5 factors. This one also is a good slide. It has about 60 countries listed in here, and how those countries fit into the 4 quadrants. As you can see, the comparison is tolerance to respect versus social orientation, individualistic versus collectivistic. And it kind of shows you where those countries, for example, let's take Japan. Basically, Japan, as we all know, is a collectivistic society. They value the group more than the individual, and then they, as I said, Japan is on the 4th quadrant on the top right, to the top, the 4th one on the right. Japan is a collectivistic society, and the same thing is from a power perspective, power orientation. They respect power, right? So that's basically it. And then you can see other countries where they fit into the spectrum. So we're getting close to the end of the presentation. So I want to share with you some of the good things, best practice to you can do to help you succeed in your endeavor, succeed in your project. So, for example, if you're traveling to do a project in China or India, ask the local residents for proper behavior. Don't make any assumption. Ask. You don't want to be in a situation where it may create some embarrassment. Understand there are local differences. Understand there are differences between your culture and their culture. Try to avoid cultural stereotyping. We all have that bad habit. We stereotype individuals. But then in this situation, you've got to avoid that cultural stereotyping. Understand that other cultures may view women at the workplace differently from your culture. Be prepared for cultural diversity in your team. Next thing is we'll talk about risk quickly. Now, my experience has been when you manage projects internationally, all risks are high. Basically, managing multinational projects should be classified as complex because things that we just talked about. Some cultures may have different views on risk. Some are risk tolerance, others are risk averse. So you really have to understand that culture you're doing business with. How do they value risk? Team diversity is a risk by itself. You're going to have team members from different parts of the world. There will be room for miscommunication, misinterpretation, cultural clash, many things. So the team shape, the team diversity is a risk by itself. Revenue and project tracking is a risk. Well, why is that? Well, assume that you're located in the U.S. and you deal with a dollar, and then you have a project in England. Well, they deal with a sterling, okay? And then the valuation of the money changes. The exchange rate changes almost probably sometimes every hour. So if you let's say you make certain revenue or certain profit last year on your project, and the yen was high, was low, then you're going to make more dollars. If the yen is, not the yen, the sterling is high, then you're going to bring home less dollars. So as you can see, the exchange rate has also an impact on the revenue and the profit that you're going to be bringing from your project. Other things I want to share with you as far as the success factors, best practice, is to really use good project management disciplines. Understand your host country, their history, geography, other things. Get help early. Keep up to date on current international affairs. Stay up with the news. Look at the internet and try to study that country. That would really help you quite a bit in ensuring a successful project. Other things is to adapt a good communication strategy. As I said, use written communication more than verbal. Assume nothing. Double check everything. Validate requirements. Consult with local resources before you even travel to that country. I'm sure in your corporation, you may have resources working for you in that country you're going to be traveling to. You can check with them. They can help you have a better understanding of their culture and how things are. And then finally, just a reminder, don't execute before you plan. That's really goal number one for project managers. You got to do good planning before you execute. So here are some links to useful websites. As you can see, the internet is full of good information, and there's some good ones here to help you understand the world, understand different cultures. There are maybe some books that you can buy. I know there's a good book that comes to mind, which I personally have. It's called Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hand in 60 Countries. It's a wonderful book that talks about 60 countries where you can learn more about their culture. You know, the book label is kind of funny. The book title is kind of funny, but I think it's worth it. Because as you know, like in Japan, they bow when they greet somebody. In France, they probably kiss on the cheeks. In the U.S., they probably shake hand. Other part of the world. So I think it's a good resource that I would highly encourage you. There are other books that you can buy that would help you, you know, alleviate some of those, you know, issues or challenges you're going to face when you're doing international projects. Again, I want to thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Again, my name is Yassin Chickha. I'm with Masters Consulting and Technology, MCNT. I'm located in Charlotte. Our website is www.mastersct.com. Thanks again, and hope to share with you some other thoughts in the future. Thank you.